Set by Kit. My name's Steve Young. I head up the ACI, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined with a really expert panel for this investigating greenwashing topic. So with no further ado, let me go to each of them to introduce themselves. And if I may, Hannah, to you first, please.
Thank you so much, Steve. I head the ESG intelligence practice at Risk Advisory. Just to give some very brief background about what we do, we work across 4 overlapping service lines: disputes investigations, strategic and commercial intelligence, traditional integrity investigations, and then ESG. But at the heart of all of those service lines is a basic offering, which is intelligence provision. And we help our clients to acquire the information and the context they need to make decisions. And the overarching goal of our ESG practice is really to bridge the gap between decision makers and those affected by those decisions, with a particular emphasis on complex international markets.
Thank you, Hannah. Most welcome. And Lindsay, may I come to you?
Hello, lovely people. My name is Lindsay Forrester. I am the President of Sustainability for Wood PLC. Wood is an energy service company. We work in multiple sectors, in multiple geographies across the world. And my role is very much to embed sustainability at the heart, including managing ESG risks on behalf of the company, working with a great number of fantastic professionals. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Steve.
Thank you, Lindsay. And listen, last but not least, someone who is no stranger to the ACI audience, Joanna.
Hi, everyone. Very nice to see you this morning. And so I'm Joanna Ludlam. I am the global co-chair of our investigations, compliance and ethics practice here at Baker McKenzie. And we're a team that spans 47 countries, over 500 of us, focusing on ethics and integrity issues across the board, whether that's on an advisory basis or investigations. I'm personally a litigator by background, and my specialism is investigations. And we're increasingly seeing more and more investigations into ESG matters. So it's a really hot topic, and I'm looking forward to discussing it today.
Right, thank you, Joanna. So investigating greenwashing, this is such a massive topic. So what we thought we'd do is, first of all, try to gauge the experience of the audience, those of you who have very kindly joined us today. So if I may, Ellie, ask you, could you please post the first poll question, which is going to be, how do you rate your understanding of what greenwashing is? And if the participants to the webinar, if you could just click on one of those to vote, and then it will take us just 30 seconds for the poll to show us the percentage of what the audience understanding is. And just for my colleagues, okay, so 16% high, 49% medium, and 36% low. So that gives my colleagues on the panel a chance to gauge your level of understanding. So Hannah, if I may come to you first, can you explain what your perception of greenwashing is, please?
Sure. And I'm super interested to hear what everyone else's are, because I feel like, as with a number of things in ESG, there's no one agreed on definition for pretty much anything. But I think of greenwashing in two kind of basic buckets. The first is what I would think of as deliberate or cynical misrepresentation. And when you look at some of the investigations that are pending by the ASA, but in the UK, but many other organizations internationally, a number of these, when you look at them on face value, they seem quite cut and dry. There is a deliberate false representation of a product or an issue or of a company. But I do think you can also flip the question a little bit and think about, where does real ESG leadership and messaging that viewpoint, how does it become greenwashing? And I think that can happen through a less kind of obviously fraudulent process, and ultimately it's when there's a disconnect between a company's stated values and its leadership, and by extension its activities. And we're obviously a service provider in this space, right? So the key way that we've seen it manifest is when we have clients or potential clients who have activities in emerging and politically complex markets, but then they have a disinclination to engage with the level of nuance and context that you need to really understand those markets, and then to make the most effective decision about your messaging and about your ESG activities and operations. So I think when there is that unwillingness, and there can be a number of reasons for it. I mean, this work is expensive, it's time consuming, it's ultimately very difficult to do, and it doesn't necessarily make your decision making easier, right? Because having more information can just make that process harder. But ultimately, I do think that a willingness to engage on those issues in a comprehensive manner is a sign of a corporate culture that values strong and authentic ESG leadership. And the converse is also true. When you don't have those things, then you have a sort of inevitable slow slide to greenwashing.
Thank you, Hannah. Lindsay, do you agree with Hannah?
I certainly do, and I think for me and as a business, I think it's this extension of ethical behaviour, and it belongs in that subset. So greenwashing, you know, it's not just the deliberate misrepresentation or falsification, which, as Hannah's already said, you know, there's a deliberacy there, but then there's the other side of the coin where when you're overstating the environmental credentials of a product and service, and that there's that very grey line, and defining that grey line between what is and what is not greenwashing that's the sweet spot, and it comes down for me as an authentic business and an ethical business, and that's why it fits nicely into that ethics space. And for me, yes, it's the falsifying, it's the over exaggeration, but there's that contextual, linking products and services with something that is clearly very green but has a very tenuous link. And again, you know, these are things that we're learning about, and the investigations that are going on at the moment are starting to test the periphery of what is and what is not greenwashing. And I think it's one of those definitions that is continuing to define itself and growing and becoming much more prevalent. And it's one of those risk areas that businesses are waking up to. Yes, where you've got business and consumer, and there's obvious potential greenwashing there. We were talking earlier, just before the call, about hotels and the greenwashing and where greenwashing came from. But then there's more nuanced. It's does it smell? Does it pass the smell test? Are we authentic in the claims that we make and what we say about our company and our services? So it's one of those developing areas.
So thank you, Lindsay. So Joanna, 2 quick points from Lindsay and Hannah before I come to you. Lindsay talks about as part extension of ethical behavior, and if I may pick up on Hannah described as a deliberate and cynical misrepresentation. I like the word cynical. So what's your perception, Joanna? And also if you could give us some of the legal landscape around greenwashing.
Sure. So just picking up on Lindsay's reference to hotels, the concept of greenwashing first emerged in a 1986 essay, which was written by an environmentalist called Jay Westerwelt. And he denounced hotel practices of encouraging guests not to reuse towels and not put them out for washing every day, apparently to protect the environment, but in fact as a measure to cut costs. And so that's where the concept really began. And I do agree that sometimes greenwashing is deliberate, and sometimes companies don't actually even know they're greenwashing. And one important question I think to ask yourself is why are people greenwashing? And I think what we've seen in recent times is that consumers are much more likely to spend money on companies and brands that are seen to be ethical and environmentally friendly. And Gen Z in particular is a group of the population that is very motivated to consume according to its perception of the ethical standards of an organization. And there was a sustainability report produced by Nielsen's where they found that 66% of consumers would spend more on a product if it comes from a sustainable brand. So therefore, there is a huge incentive on organisations to position themselves favourably on that metric. And turning to your question about the legal landscape, well, it's currently a really complex patchwork of different laws and standards and guidance. So you have consumer laws, which provide a legal framework for greenwashing liability. You've got the Consumer Rights Directive and the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive in the EU, and then the Federal Trade Commission Act in the US, and the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading Regulations in the UK. And there are equivalent regulations and laws in other countries. And in general terms, this type of legislation prohibits unfair commercial practices, false and misleading claims, misleading omissions of material information, for example. And then you have alongside that advertising law and standards. So in the UK, that's the Advertising Standards Authority, and that has power to request the withdrawal of infringing adverts, and it can refer persistent offenders to the Competition and Markets Authority, the CMA, and it publishes its rulings. So although it's not an enforcement agency as such, it has the potential to cause considerable reputational damage when reporting on infringing adverts. And then alongside that, you have legal concepts such as fraudulent and negligent misrepresentation. You have contract law, so you can resort to contract law if a product doesn't do what is promised. You also have competition law, which kicks in where a company claims that its products are greener than its competitors' products. But what we're seeing is a kind of nascent legal landscape around this area, but an increase in formalization of laws. And so we're seeing an increase in mandatory reporting requirements around ESG credentials. The EU is comparatively more advanced than elsewhere, I would say, on that front. So there's the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which came in March 2021, which sets some new transparency standards requiring entities that provide investment or insurance services in the EU to classify their products. And then in France, you've got laws that directly sanction greenwashing. And in the UK, there is going to be mandatory reporting across the UK economy by 2025. But already we're seeing, since earlier this year, mandatory reporting for 1,300 of the largest UK corporates and financial institutions. And so, and along with those mandatory rules that are emerging, we're seeing a real focus by some of the large government agencies. So the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US has prioritized greenwashing for enforcement. Here in the UK, the FCA is particularly focused on it. But what's really evident to conclude is that the ESG regulatory action and enforcement situation is far from at its full potential in identifying cases of greenwashing and being able to effectively address them. So we're going to see an increasing emergence, I think, of regulation and law around this area.
Yeah, Joanna, may I just come back to a point you made, just because our audience is on from all around the world. You mentioned the CMA. Could you just give us a sentence on what that stands for, who they are, and should we be worried about them?
So the answer is yes, you should be a little bit worried about them. That is the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK, and it's effectively an agency that has powers to regulate competition in the United Kingdom. And in September 2021, specifically in the context of greenwashing, it published a Green Claims Code, which sets out a number of principles specifying that environmental claims must be truthful and accurate, they must be clear and unambiguous, you mustn't omit critical material information, you must only make fair comparisons with other competitor products, and your claims must be able to be substantiated. And the code is really based on existing consumer protection law. So it's not new law as such, but it flows from that existing consumer protection law, and it gives the CMA authority to enforce directly some of the laws that pre-existed. So yes, it's an active enforcement agency in the UK, and we need to be aware of it and concerned about its powers.
Yeah, thank you. And the code that you mentioned, I presume that's publicly available on their website?
Absolutely. So you can find the Green Claims Code on the CMA website. You can also find reference to the underlying legal framework, so the consumer protection from unfair trading regulations there as well. So if you want more information about that, absolutely, go and have a look there. And trading standards is also a very good user-friendly source of information, not too legalistic, very much based to support consumers. So that's a great source of information if you want to educate the non-legal members of your organization.
Okay, thank you, Joanna. Just before we leave, our perceptions of greenwashing, any further words from Lindsay or Hannah, or you feel we've covered it? I've certainly got a better understanding now of what it is. No, we're good. Lindsay?
No. I'm good. I think it was some really good points coming out of there, but it is a grey area, and it is something that is still developing. And we'll continue to see, I think, over the next 12 to 24 months, much more clarity coming out, particularly in the regulatory space, as Joanna's already pointed out. And I think it's one to watch. It's an exciting time.
Right, thank you. So before we get into the real meat of the investigations piece, let's talk about that prevention is better than cure. And again, let's take a temperature reading from our audience. So Ellie, if I can have the next poll question, please, which is going to be, do you know what preventative measures to take to avoid greenwashing? So we'll just give our participants a few minutes to answer. And in terms of preparation, just as with the previous poll question, Hannah, I will come to you first once we have the results on the screen. Ellie's just put them up. So let's see, where are we? We are 43% no, 6% yes. That's a very, very small number of our audience that know what preventative measures to take, and half would like to know more. So Hannah, may I come to you, please?
Yeah, of course, Steve. So I think for me, there are three key things to take into account when it comes to prevention. And the first one would be to avoid, this is going to sound very basic, but to avoid false claims through having that strong internal culture and those strong internal values. And really, I'm repeating what Lindsay has already said here, but one of the things that has struck me both when she said it just now and when we were talking earlier was the importance of authenticity at the leadership level. And that's not the whole battle, but it does seem to me that if your leaders believe in their ESG messaging and believe in its value, then that is a significant step in your way to avoiding greenwashing and having that preventative measure in place at a very base level. And then in sort of, I guess, a more practical sense, I think that there is a need to really focus on materiality when you're looking at ESG risks. It's very easy for what is technically a truth to mask a material inconsistency when it comes to ESG messaging. As Joanna was saying, actually, I think the investment space is a great example of this. You see this rush of funds that are rebranding as ESG focused, having sustainability mandates, but there is that lack of standardization means that people can be very creative in how they're applying those terms, and there's definitely positive moves from regulation with the SFDR and taxonomy regulation, but I think you still have a problem for asset managers, which is how do you get the information and the intelligence to fulfill the requirements that are coming through without greenwashing, whether consciously or unconsciously. And then building off of that point, there is a data availability problem, but then you also need to support that data with nuance, because none of these issues ever exist in a vacuum. And certainly what we see in the course of our work, which again does tend to be in very specific international markets, so maybe there are a set of quite specific problems attached to that, is that cultural context, local context, geopolitical context, all of those things have massive relevance. And you need to take all of that into account if you're going to stop your positive E ignoring problems with your S or your G, or any combination of those three things, really.
Thank you, Hannah. So Lindsay, my guess is in your role, you are extremely focused on prevention and you absolutely do not want a greenwashing episode. What would your advice be for our audience?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. It's part of your company's integrity. Greenwashing affects not just your reputation, but your standing, and it's really one of those things that once you've fallen into the greenwashing territory, the damage that you do to your brand, your company, your goods and your service is immeasurable. People lose trust in you. So prevention is way better than a cure. And we've got all of the tools that are already in our organizations. The big part of prevention is awareness, awareness, awareness. So people need to understand about greenwashing as a concept, but how that practically applies to the goods and service that they deliver as a front-facing customer interface. What does that really mean when it comes down to it? What does greenwashing mean? So awareness is absolutely key. Then we've all got the same tools and toolkit, which is look at the risk, use our risk management processes to really hone down where is that material risk going to manifest within a business. And once you've started to identify that, then you can throw your resources in the areas of the focus where you've got that most squashy area. And Joanna, you touched on a point earlier with the regulators. There's a level of transparency. If we're going to make a claim about a product or a service, then those sources that need to be credible, multiple sources, external verification of the claims that you make about a particular good or service, but very much on that transparency piece. Then there's a whole lot of having policies and procedures, what you can, what you can't say, being very fixed, teaching your people about it, giving people that matrix to work in, getting that credibility audit trail, the due diligence, external verification to credible standards like AA1000. There's a whole plethora of tools that are already built out there. Greenwashing is a risk to a business. It's a subset of risks to the business from a reputational. I think we've got everything that we need there to undertake a management of this particular issue. It's just a case of getting that awareness and being very focused where it happens.
Thank you, Lindsay. And Joanna, if I may come to you for your view on prevention, and then I'm going to pause because we've a few very pertinent questions from the audience. So Joanna, your view first, please.
So mitigating greenwashing risks is going to be really challenging, I think, but it's really essential for businesses if they're going to avoid the legal and reputational impacts that we're talking about. And when I was talking about the legal framework, what I didn't mention is the kind of connected but related risks. So it's not just about regulatory enforcement and fines, it's about shareholder activism, it's about reputational damage in documentaries on social media, it's about climate related litigation, it's about pressure being brought to bear by shareholders. And I think what's really interesting about this space is that in order to effectively mitigate the risks, it requires a very close collaboration between the marketing team, the investor relations team, the sales teams, legal and compliance, if this is going to work well. And my advice would be as follows. Ensure that your marketing activities are responsible. And by that, I mean pay attention to the name of your product, to the classification of it, to the accuracy and completeness of information about it. Your marketing statements need to be unambiguous. You need to be careful not to overclaim. You need to refrain from using certain expressions. So, for example, in France, the concept of carbon neutrality is now regulated, and there is a clear standard that if you do not fulfill that standard, you will be in breach of French law on the subject. So, you know, as Lindsay said, being aware of the laws and regulations that apply is the starting point. And then I think, you know, having a really robust ESG methodology in order to substantiate your credentials is critical. So that involves having the ability to robustly externally verify the claims that you're making. And that, in a nutshell, is at the heart of the controls environment, I think.
Okay, thank you, Joanna. So what I shall do, important we take these questions. If I read out the question, I'd ask my panel colleagues to put your hand up if you want to take the question, and I shall come to you. The question is, are there some compulsory audit requirements for certain industries before their reports are published? And by that, I'm assuming that, you know, their final reports, their annual reports. So do any of the panel members know of any compulsory audit requirements for certain industries?
Well, certainly, as I said earlier, Steve, in the financial context, there are, you know, an increasing number of mandatory reporting obligations. So if you are, you know, in the financial services industry, that is an industry which is particularly well progressed in terms of its mandatory reporting. There are also mandatory requirements for public companies. So that is another area of, you know, that where you need to be particularly careful to ensure that your annual reports are, you know, accurate. So that's what I would say would be the two standout areas for me.
Lindsay, anything to add on what Joanna said?
I think when it comes down to your annual report and accounts, there's disclosure of non-financial risk issues in there. And whilst, yes, there are the mandatory financial number auditing that's going on, increasingly there is independent validation of the statements that you make in those non-financial risk statements. Definitely an area that's growing.
And Hannah,
and Steve, sorry, just to add on that, what I would do is point attendees towards the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD, and that's what I was alluding to earlier about the mandatory requirements being applied across the whole of the UK economy by 2025. But we're really only in the financial, in the largest UK companies do we have that mandatory to date. So since April this year, as I said earlier, about 1,300 of the largest organisations in the UK are already in that space. But take a look at the TCFD. That's where you'll find information about mandatory reporting.
And just on that, the TCFD, many companies are using things like your CDP, so the Carbon Disclosure Project, to comply with TCFD. So it's not just within that auspices of your financial report and accounts, it's anything that you might disclose in terms of your carbon related risk issues. And we've got hot on the heels TNFD, which is nature related financial disclosures, which we'll see coming in the next 24 months. I think it's likely to take the same course as TCFD. So all good stuff.
Thank you, Lindsay. Hannah, anything to add on what Joanna and Lindsay have said?
I have nothing to add, but I wanted to ask them a question, if that is allowed,
Please
Steve.
do.
So I was wondering, what do you guys think about that direction of disclosure? And do you think that there are any risks attached to what it could do to decision making? Does it add a certain, I think it's inevitable that it will happen, but does it add a risk of sort of taking some of the nuance, some of the decision making out of it as a process?
To be honest, Hannah, I think it's a good thing, particularly from our investor point of view. It's leveling the playing field, where you get some who will disclose in a transparent manner, we get other companies who don't. The mandatory reporting has been really good to level that base of knowledge and get some transparency and some clarity. TCFD is given a really good framework to report in, and it gives us that ability to measure apples with apples.
Yeah.
Prior to that, you could literally put a boundary around the data that you decided to put into the public domain. That's not always good. And again, it borders on that greenwashing. If you're very tight on a boundary and make certain claims about a part of your organization based on very limited information, when you know if you gave people the bigger picture, it gave a false sense of a different point of view. Those kinds of mechanisms, they're great. And to be quite honest, I'm a bit thick. I like to be able to have some nice regular borders to report in. Makes my job easy.
I think that's a really important point, that at the moment, as I said earlier, that there's a real patchwork landscape of different regulations, and some have the force of law and some don't. And it's very difficult, I think, if you're in a role as a chief compliance officer or a member of the compliance team, to impose standards against constantly moving goalposts. And I think the real benefit of having some clarity is that, and it enables you to understand what you're working towards, which is, a critically important thing to have in an organization if you're ever going to get things done.
Yeah, no, that's such a good point. The apples to apples comparison is, I think, so it is so important. What I kind of had in my mind was whether there was a trend towards what could end up being a bit of a tick box exercise. But I think you're right. You have to have some standardization really to make progress. Sorry, Steve.
No, Hannah, please, absolutely perfect. Look, I just think for the benefit of our audience, if I may impose on the panel, I think what we'll do, we have a lot of attendees and you've made references to some extremely valuable codes and terminology. I tried to write it down, TCFD, but I think what we'll do, we have the emails of all the folks who've registered. We'll prepare a note with the links to those codes that we will share so that this audience can get the maximum benefit out of the advice that you're kindly given. If I may just go to another question, I'm afraid you've attracted a lot of questions. We won't be able to take them all, but the next one is, from the past case histories, what is the distribution of root causes of greenwashing, such as compliance costs, boosting image or reputational damage, resource limitations? So I think the audience member is asking, what can we learn from past histories? Any takers on that one, please?
Well, I think one thing we can certainly learn is that reputational risk is really quite material here. And if you think about some of the high-profile cases in this area, so Volkswagen, for example, around emissions, there have been lots of targeting of major consumer goods brands in the US in particular, so Coca-Cola. There's also been a targeting of IKEA around some of its sustainability and environmental related claims relating to sourcing of timber, for example. And that really, the exposure to IKEA came out through a report by an NGO called Earthsight. And there was not even a legal case brought in that particular case, but yet quite a lot of media attention, and no doubt some difficult questions from investors. So I think really the big learning for me is that it's not just about the legal liability here. The risks are really far-reaching, and in my experience, they also tend to be quite multifaceted. So the cases that I've been involved in, there have been multiple fires that have ended up being fought on different fronts. So, for example, whistleblowers. Then you have customers, inquiring about issues. You've then got potential litigation around climate change breaches, climate law breaches. you then got investigations by enforcement agencies. So when these events start to take on a bit of momentum, they are not one single risk that you're dealing with at any one time. It's not like being sued for breach of contract where you're dealing with one counterparty on a very narrow point. This can be quite broad and quite multifaceted. So I think the real takeaway for me in terms of the learning from this is that we have to be much more guarded against over-exaggeration of our claims in this area, because it might look like an easy win to attract consumers, but on the other hand, the downside risk is very considerable if you get yourself in a position where you are under attack from different directions.
Thank you, Joanna. Lindsay, Hannah, anything to add on that point?
I think for me, Steve, there's a disconnect in our risk management processes. And from a business point of view, we need to make sure that we've got that robustness. So greenwashing is a risk. It's a serious risk for a business. It needs to be identified and managed just like we manage any other risk. And I think there is, at the moment, some of the cases that were mentioned there is clearly there's a disconnect between, say, marketing departments saying these things and the clear identification of the risks behind the statements that you put out into the public domain. If you're going to say to somebody and you're going to put those kinds of information or statements or whatever it happens to be into a public domain, there are clearly risks by any disclosures that you make, and you really need to be identifying them and putting them on the radar. I think for too long these things we've always known there's been greenwashing about, but I think it's really shot up the agenda now, and it's really now linked to the integrity of a business. So use the tools that we've already got, get them out there, because I think the root cause for me is not connecting that risk with how serious it can be within your company.
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay. So I'm just going to point out to the audience, we have a lot of questions. The way the ACI deal with those, we don't leave them hanging. You will get a response from this panel. It will just be impossible to get through all these detailed points in the time we have. A lot of them are investigations related. So what I'd like to do is move on to the final segment. And if I may, Ellie, if we can have the final poll question, which is to do with, have you investigated a case of greenwashing? And just again, while it takes a few seconds for the results to be loaded, true to form, Hannah, I will come to you first after we get the results to give us your guidance on how to investigate greenwashing. So we should see the percentages. Let's see, we are, well, a very, very small number of the audience actually involved. 48% no, 5% yes, by providing some sort of support. And obviously what we would hope, 44% would like to be prepared. So Hannah, to you first, what's your guidance on how to investigate greenwashing, please?
Sure. So the way that this manifests for us would be that we're either assisting our clients in an internal investigation of greenwashing allegations as an independent third party, or we might be supporting them in the investigation of a possibility that claims made by entities in their supply chain or in their portfolio could be subject to greenwashing claims. So I think my first sort of impulse is to say that there's no need to reinvent the wheel totally on this one. At their core, greenwashing investigations are in response to alleged misrepresentation. And so our goal is always to find the pertinent information, weigh it against its sources, and then assess the findings. And that's the same core methodology that you would use in any kind of internal investigation or reputational dispute. And if we're thinking about the particularities that come with a greenwashing investigation, I think, as Joanna has touched on, determining the right legal or regulatory framework can be challenging, and the requirements could differ a lot between industries and jurisdictions. I think there's also a greater risk that there is a larger scope to look at here, as we've been discussing. Like, reputational impact is such a big part of this, and I think your investigation has to be wider. You need to look at a subject's culture, its claims, what are its ingrained business practices, all of these things that can have, as Lindsay said, lots of shades of grey involved. And then I think finally it comes back to that context point, which is greenwashing cases tend to have a more outward-looking approach. You need to take into account the social, the political, the broader context, and that is a bit of a difference from perhaps a traditional investigation.
Thank you, Hannah. So Lindsay, if I may come to you, because I'm thinking you don't really want to ever have to do a greenwashing investigation, right?
Absolutely not. It's a subset of ethics. It's fraudulent behaviour, and clearly, you know, it damages the business in so many ways. And when it comes to investigations, greenwashing is like any other ethics investigation for us. It's serious. There are already rules and tools in a toolbox for us to use. It's not a bolt-on. It's very implicitly embedded within our whistleblowing and investigation process that we have. I think what is slightly different is that we have to have the right investigations team, which may be different than ethics teams, investigation teams that we've had before. You've said that we don't want greenwashing, and to get to the nub of the root causes of why we got into that territory in the first case, we need different SMEs as part of that investigation team. We also need to be upskilling our investigation teams to show them what good looks like, because it is fairly new on that investigation spectrum. Things like, for example, what does good due diligence look like? What does a credible source look like? What kinds of standards would we be using? And in previous discussions, we've talked about AA 1000. I like the fact that we can use external processes and standards that have a good use and good reputation, and to use it. And I think that's one of the most important things. And again, the investigation team, because of greenwashes, as Hannah said, it's very wide-reaching and external looking. It's making sure that investigation teams are equipped with the knowledge to work out how we would codify that learning into our governance systems, which might be very different than the kinds of investigations we had before.
So Lindsay, may I just come back to you with a quick question before I come to Joanna? And the audience, only 3% have been involved in a greenwashing investigation. Do you feel, you mentioned bringing the right SMEs to the table. Do you feel out there in the market, whether it's legal, consultancy, corporate investigation, that expertise is out there?
I think, Steve, one of the things when I was alluding to is the environmental and eco and those kinds of SMEs that potentially we hadn't bought into those kinds of investigations before. I think the people are out there. It's just making sure that we've got the right mix and balance on investigation teams, and really drawing on those kinds of, if you've got an eco claim that you've made about a certain thing that's under investigation, then you'll need that kind of SME who understands the science behind a particular related claim, and also who can do the due diligence on maybe the scientific papers that they're based on. That's what I was trying to allude to. And yes, they absolutely are there. You may have them internally. You might need to go externally because it's the same people who are included in the investigation that are under investigation. So you might need to lean on external SMEs to support it.
Yeah, so I would say, because members of our audience are principally part of the wider global corporate investigations community, this is absolutely an area worth reading up on. So Joanna, if I may come to you, but before I do, as part of your answer, could you cover 2 legal questions, please? I'll just give them to you first that you can encapsulate them in your answer. Were you surprised by the BaFin stroke German prosecutors being the first major regulator to conduct raids on the Deutsche Bank? I think they're speaking to the asset management subsidiary for material mismanagement of ESG. Why Germany, and on what legal basis was the regulatory investigation launched? That's the first question. And the second question is, should we expect more dawn raids from regulators and prosecutors in the ESG space?
Sure. So I will address those two in the context of what I'm going to say about investigations. And I agree with Hannah and Lindsay that the traditional investigation considerations still apply here. So when you're looking at scoping, privilege, resourcing, governance, engagement with regulators, etc., you're not doing anything different to a normal traditional investigation. But there are a number of other issues, I think, in ESG investigations. I just want to highlight a couple. The first is that the range of stakeholders is really considerable, as we've been talking about. It's not just one stakeholder, it's NGOs, it's consumers, it's employee groups, it's environmentalists, it's the media, it's investors, it's regulators, it's law enforcement. So having an effective communication strategy that is flexing to the right audience is really key here, and having legal and compliance or the investigations team very closely working with internal and external comms on communication is absolutely fundamental. The second point is I agree with Lindsay that you may need ESG specialists as your investigation expertise. The third point is be very careful about announcing that you're going to do a fully independent investigation. We've seen clients trip up around this in answer to pressure from whichever stakeholders are involved. They've said, don't worry, we're doing an independent investigation, and then they get external counsel involved. And although external counsel do have professional obligations to be independent and to speak the truth, on the other hand, they are being paid by the organisation that's doing it. So it's not a fully independent investigation. So I think positioning what you're doing and managing stakeholder expectations around that is really important. The other piece connected with that is transparency. So in these types of investigations, you have a much greater pressure to make public the findings of them, and that has implications for legal privilege. So you need to consider that at the outset and be mindful that there may be materials that you're creating that you will be under pressure to publish later, which in a traditional investigation you might not need to. So having an eye on that and making sure that you've worked out what needs to be privileged for the purpose of defending future litigation or enforcement action, and what you can say publicly, it's really challenging, but it's really important that you think that through. Picking up on Lindsay and Hannah's point about the external aspects of an ESG investigation, there is a focus in these types of investigations on the external parties that are affected by the conduct, unlike in a traditional investigation, and that needs really careful handling, including as regards requests for anonymity and data protection considerations. So that adds a layer of complexity when you're engaging with potential victims and NGOs. And then two more points on investigations. There's clearly a heightened business as opposed to legal risk here, with activist shareholders, investors potentially withdrawing funding from your organisation, operational risks, so supply chain interruption, recruitment challenges, and the legal risks, as I explained earlier, are complex across different legal areas and different platforms. So making sure that you look at the challenge holistically and not with a one-track view of what you're dealing with is key. And then finally, just on remediation. So as you all know, a classic kind of end point of an investigation is to look at what went wrong and how you remediate that. And that's obviously still important in the ESG context. But The difficulty with ESG investigations is that sometimes ESG issues are not easily remedied, and sometimes they might require actions by third parties that you're not necessarily in control of. So again, I think this is partly linked to the communication point. You need to be realistic about what you're promising and not overly promise, because that will compound the trust issues that the issue has created in the first place. So just to answer the questions about the BaFin and, you know, why Germany, etc. So actually, you know what, I was not particularly surprised that it was Germany where the kind of first kind of raid happened. And the reason why I say that is that in the bribery context, we've seen raids by German regulators of law firms representing clients under investigation. So they like their raids, and so this was not a particularly surprising step. And the basis, as I understand it, for the raid was around fraudulent misrepresentation and misleading the market. That was the legal basis for the BaFin's enforcement regime. So those laws in Germany would have given rise to the ability to raid, you know, linked organisations in order to investigate criminal conduct, essentially. As regards more dawn raids, well, that's a really interesting question. I think my experience is that dawn raids are vary a lot jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So there are some jurisdictions where dawn raids are, you know, a real hallmark, and Germany is undoubtedly one of those. There are also some areas of law where we are very familiar with the dawn raid risks. So in the competition law context. But what we haven't really seen, despite the ability to do it, is an expansionist process where we're seeing dawn raids in other contexts by different regulators. But having said that, I think, you know, the CMA in the UK is the most active dawn raid agency there is, and this is going to be the agency that has enforcement powers around these issues of greenwashing. So it wouldn't surprise me if that does become a theme, but I wouldn't want to be a scaremonger and say this is what's going to happen from now on in. I think the much more likely and realistic risk facing most of the attendees on this webinar today is going to be the reputational damage and the pressures to conduct internal investigations and be transparent about the outcome of that. You're much more likely to end up being in that context than you end up dealing with a dawn raid, in my opinion.
No, thank you, Joanna. Another question, please. It's really in the context of what we hope is a much more climate conscious world. The view of each panel members if they've seen a rise in greenwashing whistleblowers. I'll go to you first, Lindsay.
The quick and short answer is not at this moment, but I fully expect in the course of the next few years to see that, particularly from the younger generation as it joins the workforce. So yeah, quick answer, not at the moment.
And Hannah?
I would agree with Lindsay, not as such, but definitely greater awareness, greater concern, a greater general attitude that this is important.
And Joanna, are you seeing any?
Well, specifically around climate, no. I suspect that Hannah and Lindsay are absolutely right that it's a question of time. But for the moment, there hasn't particularly been an increase. But what we have seen is an increase in whistleblowers around ESG more broadly, and in particular around, as Lindsay so eloquently puts it, around ethical conduct. So we've seen whistleblowers around accuracy of information provided to shareholders, for example. We've seen whistleblowers around treatment of communities. And so, you know, we've also seen a huge amount of Twitter activity. So actually one of the most problematic things that I've had to deal with was 2 whistleblowers around the same, relating to the same organisation, that met one another because they had both had different calls to be whistleblowers and joined forces and combined their pressure tactics and fed information to shareholders, who then have brought a US class action suit against the organisation. And so, and that little relationship of the whistleblowers began on Twitter and continues on Twitter. So in parallel to the US class action, you've got some really activist constant pressure being applied from different directions on different themes, but in a very concerted and combined way. So I think managing those stakeholders is one of the biggest challenges.
So thank you, Joanna. So one of the things about doing these webinars, we often wonder, where does the hour go? We're coming up to the end. So what I'd like, if you can just take 30 seconds each to give your closing remarks, and true to form, Hannah, if I may come to you first.
I think what I'm taking away from today, and what I feel like I get every time I have conversations around this kind of topic, is how much I learn every time it happens, and what that says to me about how much new activity, new information there is in this space. So I guess my takeaway really is that everyone needs to keep on actively learning and gathering information, and that is how we will see a better controls environment, better access to investigation options and skills when it comes to greenwashing, and hopefully a better outcome all around.
Wow, thank you, Hannah. That was exactly 30 seconds. Incredible. Lindsay, you please.
Oh God, 30 seconds. I guess one of my closing really is around the risk landscape is constantly changing. Things are coming off the agenda and onto the agenda, and greenwashing is definitely on the agenda. It's becoming very vogue, but more importantly, it's becoming very material to a company, and particularly very much linked to that integrity space. If it wasn't on your agenda as a significant risk before this webinar, put it on now. The more that we can do now to make our folks aware, to ensure that we understand where that greenwashing potential risk is likely to be in our organization, we can take those preventative measures, because actually we don't want to be investigating greenwashing activity. We failed. The horse is bolted. And actually what we should throw our efforts into is to making sure it doesn't happen in the first place.
Thank you, Lindsay. And Joanna, the closing word, please.
So I would say agree with everything that Hannah and Lindsay says, and in addition, the Baker McKenzie philosophy is connected compliance, and I think looking at risks in the subject matter silos that might have been a traditional approach, having people own a specific risk like antitrust or bribery or whatever it may be, is not the way forward in the context of greenwashing. You need a really collaborative and holistic look at business risk in the widest possible sense, and the entire business has a responsibility here. It's not just the responsibility of legal and compliance, but it's really get the business engaged around these risks and operating sensibly, and then hopefully you avoid the need to investigate at all.
Okay, so in the absolute dying seconds, may I take this opportunity, Hannah, Lindsay, Joanna, fantastic. Thank you so much personally and on behalf of the ACI. And on that note, we'll close the webinar. And thank you to all who attended.